admired for some time. Um, for those who don't know my backstory, I'm from Montreal, and grew up going to the Hebrew Day School system there. I went to Solomon Schechter Academy and to Bialik High School, and then my dream was to go to a school called Tufts in Boston, because I had an uncle who kept singing the praises of Tufts University. Um, at that time, I was not interested at all in pursuing the rabbinate. I mean, we're members of a synagogue, and I always was close to my rabbi and appreciated synagogue, but never imagined
And who
the
was your
rabbinate for
rabbi?
myself. So we went to two synagogues. We went to Shar Shemayim, which is where my late mother's family was at, and Temple Emmanuel, which is right almost across the street, where my father's family was at. And my great grandfather was the president of Temple Emmanuel for about 15 years, the longest serving president in the history of the synagogue. And still, the hall there is called the Grover Family Hall after his memory. So synagogue was very important to me growing up, and a real center of my life. I was teaching bar mitzvahs teaching bar mitzvah lessons in the Hebrew school, and close with the rabbis. And the name of the rabbi at Temple, his name is Lee Lerner, and he's retired now. He's a wonderful rabbi. And the Shar, when I was younger, it was Rabbi Wilfred Shushat of blessed memory. A tremendous leader of Canadian Jewry for 60, 70 years. Crazy long career. I think it was, I didn't go to Tufts. I got into my safety school, or my reach school. Someone said, apply for a reach school. And I got into Princeton, which was a reach school at the time. Princeton was an eye-opening experience for me. I think that Canadian Jews, especially Montreal Jews, have a very shtetl view of the world. The Jewish world, we all know each other. It's a community that really hasn't had many imports over the decades. So we all know each other. It's a tight-knit community. We marry each other. There's a sense of closeness there that isn't the reality for American Jews, who I think are much more embedded in the cultures of the cities and places where they're living. And when I went to Princeton, that was a real shock to me. I had never heard of a thing called a half Jew, or a thing. I think Montreal's intermarriage rate at the time was something like 4 or 5%. I had never heard of a quarter Jew, and there were quarter Jews. And I had never heard of so many Jews who had no knowledge whatsoever of the Siddur, of Torah. Judaism to them was, I think, an identity that was that they assumed from their parents, but they never really took on themselves with any seriousness other than a bar mitzvah ceremony. And Aaron, I'm sure you can relate to the experiences of many American Jews who don't consider their Jewish identity really to be primary in their lives, or their Jewish affiliations and circles to be primary in their lives. So it was an awakening for me. And I actually found Hillel to be, at the time, unequipped to challenge and engage the Jewish students that were on campus. I think that I've talked about this with so many different colleagues and friends and board members of Hillel Ontario over the years. I think Hillel was started, I don't know much of the history, but when I hear about, from those in my parents' and grandparents' generations, about these Hillel dances and Hillel social events, I think the organization was created to bring people together who already wanted to be together. And it was a social club. Jewish identity building wasn't really part of their agenda. It was a social organization that was the center of Jewish life, but but a Jewish life that was already desired by the students. And they would help to organize and meet those needs. But there wasn't that inspiration, there wasn't that Jewish identity building speech that I thought was needed. So here's the part of my story that's a little bit weird, and maybe as a conservative rabbi, a bit unique. I had heard that they were starting up this program called Chabad on Campus, and that they were going to start sending Chabad emissaries to different schools across the United States and Canada. And I went to the local Chabad emissary for the city of Princeton or the town of Princeton. And he said, it's not going to happen. He didn't want the competition of having two Chabads. You know, I think this happens here too. You know, there's Chabad on this side of the street and there's another one on this side of the street. And it's the same donor base. So they don't want to compete against each other. That's what was happening at the time, until finally enough of these, it became a question of almost the covet of the university. Like, how could Chabad not send a shaliach to a place like Princeton? It would be a statement of rejection of the students there, and also the importance of Chabad, which should be, you know, if we can be at the University of Florida, we should be at Ivy League institutions too. So we got our Chabad shaliach in my junior year, and he changed my life. And we talked. This is what we talked about. I would talk to him about, why is it that there are so many kids here who are ethnically Jewish, but they don't know anything about their heritage? And of course, it's muvan me'alav. It's obvious to me now. Well, the reason is because we haven't done anything to do the outreach that's necessary to bring them to Jewish life. And he showed me how amazing that could be, and had me convinced in my senior year to apply to rabbinical school. I wanted to be like him. Not to Crown Heights Rabbinical School, but to to our rabbinical school. That's my story.
Great story.
There was an experience that I had. Maybe I'll share it with you all because I think it relates to some of the challenges we're facing today. That helped me make up my mind to go to JTS. It wasn't the professors, wasn't the scholarship, wasn't the tuition, which was and is still high. I had an interview at a yeshiva, a prominent yeshiva in New York, to go study there. And I had the interview and everything, and then spoke to the head of the school about a challenge I have. My family doesn't keep kosher. My grandparents had a tradition at the time, which was everything to them, that on Sunday nights, we would all get together at a restaurant, me and all my cousins, and we'd have dinner together. Not a kosher restaurant. And I said to him, you know, it would just kill my grandparents if I couldn't go to that dinner on Sunday night. It would kill them. What is your policy with regards to your students going to non-kosher restaurants? And he said to me, our policy is, we understand the needs of your family, but we do not permit our students to enter into non-kosher restaurants, not for any reason at all. And that it wasn't even difficult for me to say, then I think this isn't the school for me. The reason why it relates to what's going on now is I think that we are trying to navigate through many halachic challenges that never existed before in a world where gathering together was easy and healthy and permissible. Live streaming on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and originally the question was the Seders, is a whole new question for people who try and be observant of some of the restrictions on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And sometimes I think I return to that moment, that conversation with the head of that yeshiva, when halacha stands in the way of mitzvot like honoring mother and father, like the value of community and not leaving people alone, like the value of bringing people into a service. I mean, I think we imagine sometimes rabbis in our heads, well, if we're not going to have a service at shul, I'm sure people will daven at home. It's imaginary. I know that people aren't going to daven at home. I know how much they love being a part, thank God, so many of us, of the experience of shul and the choir and a rabbi and that environment and their friends, the warmth it brings them from their youth, the sense of being loyal to a tradition. And you can't mimic that in a living room. And I think we're really at a point in a number of areas where it's about, do we let halacha stand in the way of Jewish life for so many people? Or can we try and say there's a value system that underlies this halacha? And if there is no value system, which to me, that's what God is. God is those relationships. God is bringing out the holy through our relationships. If those cannot be sustained in any way, then using a computer on Shabbat, is that serving God's will, or are we idolizing halacha in an unhealthy way? I only share it because it's a story that it keeps coming up now. As we grapple with technology. Even Rabbi Flanzraich and I were at a rabbinical assembly meeting today, and we're already talking about the high holidays and what it's going to look like, and how do we navigate the complexities of, one camera system versus multi-camera system, and what if there's recording? Isn't recording of the system not allowed on Shabbat, even though viewing might be allowed? These details are very important, but I think it's important we also remember we are here to serve the interests of enhancing, preserving Jewish life through a moment of terrible anxiety and change, and we can't lose sight of that and allow the details to get in the way.
Well said. No, very, very nicely said.
So share with us, Rabbi Flanzraich, for us, if you have a story of your
I have lots of stories.
Journey to the rabbinate.
Boy, my journey. Born in Brooklyn, raised on Long Island. My father was German, made his way to New York when he was 1 year old in 1936. My mother is Scottish. She's a fourth generation Glaswegian. And after the war, when my grandfather was discharged honorably from the British Army, they came to Brooklyn, and my parents met at Brooklyn College, and I'm alive and breathing. But my family was very traditional, not Orthodox, but Jewish day school. My shul rabbi was an absolute foundational character in my life. And through his inspiration, I went to a yeshiva for high school. It was a black hat yeshiva. I wanted to explore that world. I wanted to continue in that world, but my father was insisting that I get a university education. I didn't want to go to Yeshiva University. And the compromise was Bar Ilan in Israel. I went to Bar Ilan. I took a degree in Talmud and psychology. And that began an interesting synthesis for me in seeing Judaism and Jewish law and tradition in lots of interesting shades. You think about it, you come from a world that's traditional but not Orthodox. I went to this very, very Orthodox world, and I was deeply enchanted by it. And I am forever appreciative of it because the 4 years of Talmudic study I had there provided me a foundation that I would have never gotten in my life anywhere else. Mm-hmm. But then going to Bar Ilan and seeing the interesting synthesis in Israel of Orthodoxy, Jewish identity, Israeli identity, it began formulating and percolating ideas in my mind, so much so that, to answer one story, my first year in my Talmud study, one of the professors who asked us to do this, we had a seminar program, we each had to give a speech. Daniel Sperber, who's one of the great Talmudists of the generation, sure. Sperber, asked everybody to answer this one question. And in the Talmud, there's a principle that says, "Et la'asot Hashem la'hafer toratecha," which simply means, it's a quote from the book of Proverbs, and it says that there comes a time when you have to act for God by breaking the law. So he asked the question like this, and you have to understand, Daniel Sperber is a very observant man, very observant. So he asked a question like this. He goes, can anyone tell me that if somebody lives far away beyond walking distance from a synagogue, that they couldn't drive to the synagogue, based on that idea, once again in the Talmud, that if there's a great need, there comes a time to act for God and to disregard the law. And lots of people made lots of fancy arguments, but in the end, Sperber said to us, they can't be entirely convincing because there's no answer to it. And as Rabbi Grover said, this is one of those moments where I felt very early on that this was going to be a ground-shifting event in all of our lives, and that we needed to put aside some concerns to look after the bigger values, and that is, how do we maintain the Jewishness in people's lives? And I think that most of the congregations in the conservative world have done a remarkably good job and are going to be doing an even better job at seeing to it that people are not cut off, and that the synagogues, rather than expecting you to reach us, because you can't do that now, we're going to come reach you. Mm-hmm. And we're going to find provocative, informative, inspirational methods to get us through this time, so that, God willing, a year from now, when we are all in shul, we'll appreciate just what blessing this moment really would be. But for me, graduated Bar Ilan, I made Aliyah, I went to the army, finished the army, got my rabbinic degree in Israel, and then the Israeli economy collapsed. They had multi-100%, The Economist and Rabbi Grover will know, they had hyper inflation. There were no jobs. Mm-hmm. I went back to New York thinking I was going to be a lawyer perhaps. And things worked out that I'm here. So I never expected to be a congregational rabbi, but sometimes the best things in life happen are the things that we don't plan. Mm-hmm. And I'm very, very grateful to it. It's to have 24 years in a congregation like Beth Sholom has been one of the great blessings of my life. And every day I am so appreciative of the people that I've come into contact with.
I just want to add, Aaron, when he says that, that is when Rabbi Flanzraich says that he saw very early on that this was a ground-shifting moment in Jewish life. He really means that. And I don't know if he has the power of prophecy, but we spoke very early on. We were together on an Israel Bonds mission in February. And only a few weeks later, when the outbreak started happening in Israel, Rabbi Flanzraich called me and said, we got to start planning. It's going to be a different high holidays this year. And I listened to you, but a part of me was going, okay,
the old man
this ain't going to go on that long. Come on. High holidays. I'm sure everything will be back to normal in a few weeks. And here we are talking about what high holidays are going to look like in all of our congregations. I don't know how you saw that coming. But,
well, don't forget, I was scheduled to be in the second part of my sabbatical in Israel.
Right.
So March and April, I was supposed to be in Israel. The first part of my sabbatical, I was fortunate to be in Berlin. For November and December, I was teaching rabbinical students there at the Zacharias Frankel College. And in Israel was about 3 weeks ahead of the infection cycle that we were in Toronto. So I was seeing, first of all, nightly, they had almost a military-like debriefing of the entire country of what was going on. There was an efficiency and clarity to these press conferences, the likes of which I don't think you would see in a Western country. And they were telling us very early on the steps would have to be taken. They were showing early on the geometric patterns that would occur with infection. if these self-isolation and quarantines would not come into play. And so it became obvious to me what the extent was, that if in Israel, if they were preaching this, and for those of you who may be familiar with Israel, we had an apartment in Tel Aviv off Bogershov, right at Ben Yehuda, like right down there. So basically it's like Bay and Bloor. And about 2 weeks into us being there, which is right in the early throes of this ever increasing, tightening closure on Israeli society, we could cross the street and we wouldn't even look left and right. There were no cars. And so I knew that this was something, minus medicine or vaccines, that was going to be with us for a while. So sadly, we are where we are in this. And anyways, I wanted to, because in the Talmud, it famously says that if two Jews sit and they don't study, and if they study words of Torah, that God rejoices. And so we don't want God to be sad. So Rabbi Grover, you and I had actually thought that we would share in the time available to us each of our favorite Jewish ideas. And I wonder if you could perhaps share one with us.
Sure. I gave it some thought because I think that there's a lot that brings me to Judaism. A lot of different ideas were contending to be my number one. I thought of the value of every human life, and your story about how seriously Israel took the warnings and how they let science govern their decisions. And the fact that they are so early now to be out of this recovery because they were cautious is ultimately a story about the sanctity of human life, and I think a tremendous Kiddush Hashem for the whole world, to see how, it's easy to do in China. You just have one dictator say, we're shutting the place down. In Israel, a noisy, messy, complicated, and aggravated democracy, they did it. And for the most part, are finding themselves to be out of the worst days of the crisis. And I speak to my cousin who's there almost daily, and he's telling me about how much things have changed and are opening up now. So I think the sanctity of human life, to me, as of every life, a primary Jewish value. The idea of daily prayer, the idea of living life of purpose and of doing mitzvot. But I thought that the major sort of theme that I present tonight, which is something I've been reflecting on also this year, relates to conservative Judaism and why I think we still have an important and substantive message to offer, and relevant message to offer in a changing time. The Orthodox world is really struggling now with how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in the midst of this crisis. I think that a lot of the problems in Israel, where there were problems, it was caused by almost these gedolim, these leaders that were using magical thinking to preach that Hashem would protect you if we just stay in the yeshivas, and God forbid would we take Torah away from our yeshivas even for 1 second. And there were, unfortunately, some very serious outbreaks in ultra-Orthodox cities like Bnei Brak. And of course, we've read about many of those stories in New York too. And I hope this wakes up a lot of people to the challenges of blind obedience to your superiors and the importance of scientific study and reflective study and bringing critical approaches to Judaism, not just following what the leader says, but even finding the permission inside you to challenge a gadol and to say that he's wrong. I think over the years, more of those voices have been suppressed and pushed away. And we've always, I think, in the conservative movement, we're not such an old movement, but have prided ourselves in blending the scientific and the religious together, even though they don't always fit together so comfortably. And I thought that theme is best expressed in Talmud study. And earlier in the year, there was the big Siyum Hashas. And I took a look at what was going on in MetLife Stadium for the Siyum Hashas. I don't know if anybody here on the Zoom call saw some of the articles or the scenes at MetLife Stadium. Probably the largest gathering of Jews that I've ever seen in my life. Something like 100,000 Jews in MetLife Stadium. And the best part of the whole thing, the songs were nice, the Siyum was nice, but the best part was this one guy in the stadium who decided to dress up as Where's Waldo. Did anybody see that? There was one guy who decided to wear a white and red shirt. I think it was satire, but there's depth to that satire in a sea of black, showing that why is it so crazy that I'm standing out just because I'm wearing a different colored shirt? And the Talmud to me is such a rich treasure trove of arguments and discussions and lack of clarity, like ending a conversation with just, we don't know what the right answer is, and being comfortable with the unknowns. This passive acceptance of authority to me is so anti-Talmudic that to me, I think it is the driving idea or the idea that I wanted to present to you tonight as sort of the key to, I think, a flourishing centrist Jewish movement that I feel has still a lot of relevance and a lot to offer the Jewish world today. And I think this virus just made it clearer. The need for us to embrace the Where's Waldo and to have a MetLife gathering of Where's Waldo's, maybe the next time we do a Siyum Hashas celebration, to bring liberal-minded Jews or centrist-minded Jews back to the roots of rabbinic Judaism in a way where I think they can appreciate that this book is ours. It doesn't belong to yeshivas where they would never accept somebody like me. Jewish study is, I think, Talmud Torah keneged kulam. It really is that counterweight to everything that we hold dear. The beauty is that, by the way, with Zoom, Talmud Torah can continue, and it's easier for people to access Talmud Torah. And if that was an area of synagogue life that maybe competed with so much else in the days where we had to go to hospitals and shivas, well, now there's some of that has gone away, and the travel times that plagued all of our schedules. And I think I would like to see Talmud Torah increase in importance in all of our congregations. I think it would be an idea that helps to re-inspire people to engage in Jewish life and strengthen particularly the kinds of Judaisms that we try and preach from our pulpits.
Well said. Beautiful.
Now for you.
Hi. I want to say to you, just capturing on your idea is, I was very fortunate when I was in Bar Ilan to study with Yeshayahu Leibovich. Yeshayahu Leibovich was one of Israel's most outstanding theologians of the past century. He sadly died about 15 and a half years ago. And Leibovich would come, few interesting things about him. His sister, you might know, that's Nechama Leibovich. She was a famous biblical scholar. He was a professor in biology, chemistry, and psychology at Hebrew University. But he had on Saturday evenings after Shabbat, he had one of the most widely listened to radio programs. He would give a 15 or 20-minute Devar Torah after Shabbat, and the entire country listened to it. Religious, not observant, didn't make a difference. Everybody, and he's one of the few public intellectuals that long after they've passed away, you would be challenged to listen to the radio in Israel on any given day and not hear his name mentioned at least once. That's how profound an impact he had. So I was fortunate to study with him. And he said that he formulated the question like this. There are 60 plus volumes of Talmud. Maimonides wrote 6 volumes of Jewish law, and there are 5 volumes in the Shulchan Aruch. And he goes, how is it possible that you go from 60 plus volumes to 5 or 6? And he says the answer simply is, you got rid of all the discussions. All you have are laws. And as he famously concluded this little discussion he had with us, in Hebrew, I'm going to tell you the Hebrew first, and then I'm going to break it down for you. He said, psak halacha, which means the deciding of law, making decisions, is the freezing of law. And that loss of the Talmudic dynamic in our life, which is a uniquely Jewish dynamic. When people ask me, what books should they study to understand Judaism? I tell them to study the Talmud. You don't even have to understand most of it. But just reading it, seeing rabbi after rabbi giving an opinion after an opinion, and most importantly, in the Talmud, no one ever says, I'm right. Every statement always begins with an expression like, I would think this might be the answer. I would suggest this. There's no sense of demagoguery when it comes to positions. It's about sharing ideas, and which is a uniquely and beautiful Jewish talent. And I don't think we appreciate it enough. But in Israel, like Rabbi Grover said, it is a cantankerous, very, very aggressive and itchy kind of democracy. But when it was apparent of the crisis that was happening, Israelis have good muscle memory when it comes to emergencies. And they know how to listen to an order when they know that it matters. And the entire country fell quickly in line, so much so that Israel has a population of 9 million people. They have about 270 fatalities from COVID, which is a remarkable number. And by example, to show you, Sweden has 10 million people. They've had nearly 4,000 deaths. Now, they've also had a different approach to it as well. Now, all that having been said, when you look at numbers, if one of those 270 people were someone you loved, it doesn't make a difference at all. But the idea I actually wanted to very briefly share, and then I think we're going to open it up to some questions, should any of you, the 93 plus of you who are here joining us, if you have any questions, is this. I remember years ago reading an article by Natan Sharansky, the famous Soviet refusenik, and he wrote about how in the Soviet Union, you can never trust anybody, meaning that everyone was socially isolated. You didn't know if your next door neighbor, even if they were Jewish, if they were an informant for the KGB. And that's a social isolation. But what we're living through now is a medical isolation. It's very different from what the Soviet Union was, where you couldn't trust people. We're being isolated not because we don't trust each other. We're being isolated because we can trust each other. Because to isolate yourself is not to spread the infection to someone else. And in Judaism, when we lift a glass, by far the most common blessing that we charge our glasses with is that we say l'chaim, to life. And I want you to understand that the word l'chaim is always in the plural. It's never in the singular. I think one of the most important and animating Jewish ideas that I love so much is that Judaism cannot survive in social isolation. You can be a Jew and socially isolated, but you can't be Jewish and be socially isolated. And so witness the fact that now there are 94 people gathering on a Zoom call to listen and share this moment is without a question one of the most unique and beautiful Jewish moments that touches me. And so that's my idea. I wonder if there's anybody who has a question they'd like to share. There is a chat feature available on Zoom. And it's on the bottom of your screen where there's a menu there, and you can just start typing, and I will see, or Rabbi Grover will see the question. If you want to address it to either to one of us or both of us, please feel free. Oh, Rabbi Grover is muted.
Great. I'm unmuted now. Great.
Okay,
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Any questions? Barry Cutler, thank you very much for the thanks. It's a pleasure being here with all of you. Okay. For Rabbi Grover, do you see it?
What did you study at Princeton, and do you wish you had pursued that as your career? I studied economics. I think my average in economics was a B- in the end, but I graduated and my Jewish studies classes were all straight A's.
There you go. That was the sign.
That's proof that you succeed and you should pursue what you're interested in.
True.
Not what your father says is the reason he paid all that money to send you to an American university. I graduated in 2004, and those years were years of tremendous exuberance in the financial market. The banks were begging for graduates to come to New York and take jobs, and the salaries were in the mind of a student, you couldn't turn them down. So I did get the chance to work on Wall Street after I graduated. I worked for a hedge fund. I knew from day one that there's this culture in New York. You have to everyone says that the workplace culture, very important in financial firms. You got to fit into the workplace culture. That was a struggle for me. And I think I kept asking myself, is this what I want to do with my life? I want to make money for other people. That's why God put me on this earth. Not to disparage anybody on the line who's you do wonderful things for people, and it's important to help people with their finances. But for me personally, I just felt like, especially because living in New York, which is the land of synagogues, I would go to shul all the time, and I'd look at these rabbis, and I would think to myself, I think I could do better than that guy. That guy's, after the service, Rabbi Flanzraich and I know, you're talking about us, so you're talking about our sermons. And when I was in school, I also talked about, when I was in New York, I also talked about the rabbi. Did I like the sermon? Did I think he just whipped that one out? Or did I think it was really inspiring and amazing? And that's what excited me. So I never think about going back to the money management world. I think, like Rabbi Flanzraich, I am the luckiest guy in the world to have this job. Don't tell my board, but I would probably do this job for free. I have so much fun, and feel like every day I am living a life of purpose, and that to me is worth millions and millions of dollars. I don't know how many people are lucky enough to say every single day, I touched somebody and made their life better, or I helped make this funeral. That thank you get after you give a eulogy, and you just perfectly gave me peace with my father's memory and made this moment so much easier for me. That's what I think brings us to this job, and why it's a drug. You can't get off it, because you're never going to get a feeling like that recognition, that gratitude, and that sense that you're making a difference, that we're lucky to find multiple times in a given day.
I'll share with you, when I was debating whether or not to go into the rabbinate as a career. I'd already been ordained at the age of 24. I was in New York, and my rabbi back in New York, when I was weighing whether or not to accept an invitation to come up to Toronto to be a rabbi, he brought me into his office, and he opened up a drawer that had a box in it, and he pulls the box out. And I asked him, "What is that?" He goes, "This is the box of my love letters." Rabbi Grover is nodding, so he knows. It was a collection of nearly 30 years worth of letters and cards that people had written to him, telling him just what he had done to make their life or moment or sorrow or struggle easier or better. And he says, I save every single one, because in each one of these cards is a life of a human being whose pain was eased just a little bit. And I did my job as a human being, not as a rabbi, but as a human. I never forgot that. And and every time someone takes the time, and you think about it, someone takes the time to pull you aside or send you an email or put their arm around you and say, "Thank you so much," that's a big deal. And it's touching. And I always make sure I try to do that for people too. Someone has written, how do we get uninterested teenagers who may not have the best messages about Judaism? How do we get to their brains? And this is from Leanne Richmond. Thank you, Leanne. And she says, "Rabbi Grover, I know you have excellent skills in this area, but they're not always in your midst, especially during the university years." Leanne, I'll share with you before I turn it over to Rabbi Grover. We have at our synagogue, we have an 8-piece a cappella group. And part of some of the innovations that we've introduced in Shabbat morning is creating a shorter service and creating a different kind of soundtrack to the morning. And on Rosh Hashanah, it was on Kol Nidre night, actually, we had the a cappella group there, and they're inspiring and beautiful. We've cut an album with them, actually. And I noticed as they were singing and doing their thing, I was looking at the congregation, and the place was packed in the sanctuary. It was Kol Nidre night. And I saw 3 or 4 of our 20-somethings. They were holding their cell phones up, and they were recording it on Instagram. Now, I wasn't happy at all that they were holding a cell phone on Kol Nidre night. But I can say it provided a window, at least for me, as to how we can touch the lives of people who maybe were a little distant from us.
Yeah, I think about this question a lot. This is a major, major challenge, engaging the younger generation, and I think there are no quick solutions here. All I would say, maybe to offer a bit of hope, this session has been about reflecting on our own stories and looking at our own moments of transformation and growth, and actually looking at eras of transformation and growth in the Jewish world. How do you engage? You never know what messages stay with people sometimes and last their whole lives until they're much older. I'm sure all of us can reflect on things that are so profound and explicit in our memories, and you don't know how they got there because there are so many other things that you forgot why they ended up staying there. Maybe it was because they reached you at the right moment. Maybe because you were thirsty and needed that water to drink at that time. Maybe it's even beyond our understanding, and it's some metaphysical reason. That's why I think every encounter, every meeting with a teen, and frankly with anyone of any age, all of us have to remember, who are working as sort of representatives of Judaism, to make that moment count. And when I went on the March of the Living trip and served as the rabbi of the March of the Living trip a few years ago, they give you get 5 minutes, Rabbi, to give a speech in front of that crematorium and make it last. And I don't know what I said that day, but I still bump into those kids. I have no recollection of what I said, but I bump into those kids today. They're now in the workplace, and they say to me, "Wow, that speech you gave at Auschwitz, I still remember it."
Mm.
And it just constantly reinforces. Never say we failed or we didn't reach that kid. You don't know what message you're going to give that's going to stay with them. That sermon that you just whipped up in 15 minutes, and a year later somebody says that was the most profound message. I needed to hear that day. It changed my life. So make every moment count. Don't make sure that when you're a Jewish professional that you are representing the best of Judaism. That doesn't always mean you can tell people what they want to hear. But I think if you believe that the Torah is beautiful, then it's easy for you to make it shine.
Beautiful. So we have a question from Marlene Axsmith, which is actually a perfect segue for us saying goodnight, I think. Marlene thanks us for this being a wonderful session, and she wonders if we have plans for further sessions of this nature in the months to come. And it has my vote. I hope it has Rabbi Grover's vote.
I vote yay.
And we will set up another one. The response has been phenomenal. 96 people logged in, Rabbi Grover.
Wow.
So we will definitely do this again, and in short order. I thank you all so much. And Rabbi Grover, it's been such a wonderful way to spend the evening with you and everyone else. So lift your tea glasses, coffee, whatever it is you're drinking, my friends. And l'chaim, Shabbat Shalom. And we will see each other soon.
L'chaim, health and good things for everyone.
Amen.